In America, we worship freedom, freedom at all costs. In fact, I think it's safe to say that in general, there's very few people here that think that there's a such thing as too much freedom and too many possibilities. Advertisers, of course, know this and encourage it. And in the last few decades, been an exponential explosion of choices, not just in the terms of things we can buy, but even in the things that we can choose to be. All the traditional constraints have been steadily broken down, particularly from the 60s on. Traditional roles and morals and values that have been around continue to be viewed with suspicion as tyrannical and oppressive and limiting. In some cases, of course, they were. It goes without saying that some of those roles and morals were. But I, I also am not advocating for any kind of ill-advised return to the way things were done, particular since we have yet to determine exactly what about the so-called old days seem to support greater levels of well-being and happiness, as we've talked about in other videos. I seriously doubt that social structures that excluded women or tolerated hate and violence against LGBTQ plus persons, for example, contributed to a greater sense of well-being overall. But those things have changed and moved towards a more ethically favorable state, and those things, I think, are laudable. But they don't explain why we are, generally speaking, sadder, more anxious, more apt for addictions and self-harm behavior than we were in the past. I think that has more to do with uh, things that have very little. I think it's likely, let me say it this way, I think it's likely that such changes have little to do with the worsening mental health state and progression towards more ethical treatment of others is desirable on ethical grounds, and that there's something else going on that's causing the worsening of mental illness. So, what we have to do is take a look at some of the cultural changes that have happened, I think. That's where we're going to find the culprits. There was a famous article by a psychologist named Barry Schwartz back in 2000, wrote an American Psychologist about what he called the tyranny of freedom. What is he talking about here? So he's looking at the fact that psychology has often been focused on empowering patients to unlock their own self-actualization, open up more and more possibilities and opportunities. And depression was seen as a situation of learned helplessness in the face of harmful, constricting environments. And of course, the balm to that is to remove all barriers to freedom. So why should anyone be subjected to arbitrary cultural constraints? Who gets to decide what's right and wrong? Who should decide what I get to do, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, strangely enough, there seems to be a point at which the removal of all constraint and opening up of limitless possibilities has this kind of paradoxical effect on the human psyche. And in fact, if we choose to strip away all sorts of cultural rules, as it were, claiming that, deconstruct them and claiming they're all arbitrary and so forth, as tyrannical and oppressive and so forth and so on, then we wind up in this interesting situation of greater and greater freedom, but that seems to bring an anxious state. So, now, what am I talking about here? So, it's true that some value systems needed to be dismantled and taken apart. But as Schwartz asks, modern Americans refuse to have their behavior governed by tradition, and market-driven affluence frees us from most of the dictates of necessity. As a result, everything is a matter of choice. But this is the best of all possible worlds, isn't it? Or is it? So you could still ask, though, okay, but Dr. G, what's the evidence that this is actually bad? What is the evidence that it actually is upsetting anybody? So some of this we've kind of described. For example, the rising rates of depression and anxiety. I've already talked about this in other videos. And that correlates with an explosion of choices offered to us. Any trip to a typical Walmart or something, and you can find a huge number of everythings that is there. I mean, do we really need 900 different kinds of toothpaste? or dog food or all this. Nevertheless, that's the situation we have. Well, why would that cause worsening of mental illness, though? As it seems, though, over the decades, personal, religious, ethnic, racial, class, geographic, gender norms are all seeming to disappear. And again, I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, particularly if they were extreme and unfair. And in many cases, they were. There is never any excuse for bigotry or violence. And I would strongly recommend advocating for those people who find themselves in those marginalized categories. All I'm asking is there a point at which stripping away down social norms becomes more harmful than beneficial? Mobility has skyrocketed, consumer options have exploded, and yet we're more anxious and mentally ill now than we ever were before. We have to ask ourselves, is there any reason to think increased choices might be the cause of this? That's tough to answer. But consider that when we are offered more choices, we tend to naturally increase our expectation of control. This is where the psychology of this comes in. The more choices we have, the more we expect out of life. And that sounds great on the surface, but it means a gradually diminishing return for the satisfaction with whatever choice we finally wind up making. With limitless choice, we may become paralyzed with fear or regret over making the wrong choice. And then once we decide, we fret over having possibly missed out on something better. We expect perfection and can't accept imperfection. When things go wrong, is because we didn't choose well, so everything becomes our fault. Furthermore, excessive emphasis on individual autonomy, choice, and control as the paragon of all value ultimately comes at a cost. Community, commitment, and belonging, all of which require a voluntary reduction of autonomy and choice, if you really look at it. In other words, we can't pursue limitless individual self-actualization without chafing against what others want from us. Of course, the typical American answer to this dilemma is shout with fist to the sky that we are free to live our lives our way, don't tell me what to do, stop oppressing me, blah, blah, blah. But casting off all troublesome expectations that others have of you and breaking any and all obligations to you that you have to others, sure, that may be liberating. And if they were suffocating you and you were overextending yourself to please them, then it is a good thing to do that. But when you take this to the extreme, it gives us exactly what we wish for, a life where no one needs you and no one wants anything from you. I hear this from patients almost daily. Nobody cares about me. Nobody cares if I die tomorrow. Part of this problem can be traced back to the value of what I'm calling hyper-individualism. As we'll see, I'm going to talk about this in future videos. Over about the last 80 years, Americans and other westernized nations have increasingly traded values of affiliation, competence, extended family, interpersonal connection. They've traded all those things for narcissistic aggrandizement, material possessions, physical appearance. Freedom from any and all obligation and constraint continues to be pursued with reckless abandon, and there's no thought to the natural trade-off that must occur. As Schwartz put it, there's a dark side to all this freedom from constraint, and to all this emphasis on individuals as the makers of their own worlds, their own destinies. It leaves people indecisive about what to do and why. So just on the other side of liberation sits chaos and paralysis. Something to think about. And now, that's what I got for you today for Mental Health Monday. Make sure you subscribe. If you check out ericgoodwyn.com, there's going to be some more stuff coming your way. I've got podcasts and things like that over there that you can't get here on YouTube. So until then, I'll see you next time.